In the middle of a crowded street, a blind, elderly black woman was screamed at by a police officer, who then kicked the white cane from her hand without hesitation. As it hit the ground, he reached down and snapped it in two. A shard of wood flew up and struck her face, blood seeping through the lines of her aged skin. His expression was filled with pure contempt, and he turned away, as if completing some routine task. But what he didn't expect was that just seconds later, her son, a former FBI agent who once led a tactical response unit, would arrive. Watch until the end and ask yourself, what if that were your mother? The traffic light blinked red, and heat shimmered off the asphalt like the air itself was waiting to snap. Car engines muttered behind thick glass, a low chorus of impatience and stale air conditioning. The sun was sharp, bouncing off metal hoods and pooling in cracks between the sidewalk tiles. A figure stepped off the curb. No sunglasses, no guide, just a long gray wool coat, too warm for the weather, and a cane with a black rubber tip slicing low arcs across the crosswalk. Mrs. Mildred walked with the authority of someone who'd memorized the world by rhythm and resistance. Each tap of her cane wasn't a question, but a declaration. She was crossing, and the street would make room. The white stripes underfoot could have been invisible, but her steps knew where to land. At the midpoint, a horn erupted, then another. Tires groaned. A boot hit the pavement. "Back it up!" The voice came with weight, not warning. "Move!" it barked again. "You blind or just stupid?" The engines didn't purr now. They held their breath. The speaker, Officer Kellner, emerged from his cruiser like a hammer dropped mid-argument. His shoulders were wide, jaw wired tight, belt heavy with tools of control. He didn't walk, he planted himself. His boots landed like final decisions. Mildred didn't flinch. Her cane paused mid-sweep, hovering just above a crack in the asphalt. She turned her head slightly, the way one does when isolating a sound from background clutter. Her face offered no emotion, but her stance did, anchored, patient, unimpressed. Kellner's boot closed the space. He stepped in close enough for his polished leather to brush the edge of her shoe. He didn't make contact, but the intention hung there like an open hand before a slap. On the sidewalk, a white woman clutched her son's wrist and steered him away without a word. Her heels clicked fast, retreating as if silence could erase witness. Mildred tilted her chin upward. Not enough to be dramatic, just enough to make people wonder if she could see him. "I hear lies," she said. Her voice was smooth, measured, a knife dragged across ice. "I hear them in your shoes." Kellner stiffened. "What?" he muttered. But she didn't answer. The silence around them grew taut. Even the air seemed to retreat. Mildred tapped her cane, ticked right at the edge of his boot. He flinched back. Half an inch, barely noticeable, but it was there. She stepped forward. Not around, not back, through. Her coat brushed his leg. He stood frozen. Less a man now than a statue absorbing the weight of being seen and not being in control. She passed. No apology, no hesitation. The sound of her cane reclaimed the rhythm of the crosswalk. The street remained hushed, pulled into her orbit. Kellner didn't speak. Couldn't. A screen across the street blinked on. A phone camera recording in silence. Everyone knew this would become something. Not a confrontation, not yet, but a mark, a timestamp. When she reached the curb, she stopped. The hum of cars returned in pieces, unsure, like they'd forgotten their lines. Horns remained still. One child tugged at his mother's sleeve, pointing. She pulled his hand down gently. Mildred turned her face slightly, as if listening to something just behind her shoulder. "I hear you all," she said, not loud, not soft, even when you whisper. Kellner still hadn't moved. His body was rigid, not from duty, but from the effort of not reacting. He glanced at the phones, the stairs. He adjusted his belt. Someone sneezed 2 blocks away. The spell broke, but only a little. He stepped backward, made a vague signal for traffic to move. The vehicles hesitated. Then they rolled. Mildred didn't turn around. She resumed walking, cane tapping a cadence that had outlasted louder men. She passed a mailbox, paused to feel the heat against her cheek, then moved on. Her cane kissed the curb's edge, tapped a small pothole, and adjusted course. She knew the city's skin better than its laws. Behind her, Officer Kellner remained still, not disciplined, not humbled, just out of frame. The silence between them lingered longer than the sound. A woman across the street whispered something to her child, but her words didn't reach. Kellner climbed back into his cruiser. His hand sat idle on the wheel. His radio crackled. He didn't respond. He stared through the windshield like it owed him an explanation. He replayed it, not the words, but the stillness, the refusal, the unspoken verdict. Not fear, not even defiance, just the weight of someone who had lived too long with being stepped over to be moved by the theater. Her voice returned to him. "I hear lies in your shoes." He adjusted his mirror. The face staring back looked a little smaller now. Further up the block, Mildred turned onto a shaded street. No audience, no phones, just bricks and birds and the steady tap of her cane. She didn't walk faster or slower. She didn't shake. Her fingers never tensed around the grip. She didn't need to know if he was watching. She knew. A child peeked out from behind a gate as she passed. His eyes widened. His mouth didn't open. He wasn't scared, just unsure whether he had just seen something aloud. Mildred kept walking. Her shadow flickered over the uneven sidewalk. A breeze lifted the edge of her coat. She did not look back. And across the city, a video finished uploading. No hashtags. No captions, just the still frame of a blind woman stepping forward while a uniformed man stood in place. It didn't go viral yet, but it would, not because of the spectacle, because everyone watching would ask themselves, quietly, when alone, what they would have done, and whether she'd have heard them too. The cane kept tapping, the rhythm quiet but deliberate until it stopped. Suddenly and completely. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful, it was sharp. Like a held breath before a scream. Kellner stood behind her now, not in the middle of the crosswalk, but near the edge of the sidewalk where she'd paused just long enough to adjust her grip. Her fingers were still wrapped around the curved handle, worn smooth by time and use. She wasn't looking at him. She didn't need to. Her presence alone said what her mouth didn't have to. "You haven't moved me yet." And that, more than any insult or glare, seemed to ignite something in him, something brittle, something furious, the same kind of anger that builds in a man who's used to walking through the world like a storm and now finds the weather doesn't obey him anymore. He stepped forward, not fast, not clumsy, but with the precise confidence of someone who had been waiting to hurt something and finally had an excuse. His boot landed beside the tip of the cane. Then he raised it, and in one motion he stomped down, not on her foot, but on the cane itself. The crack wasn't loud. It wasn't supposed to be, but it was obscene in its intimacy. The way cheap wood gives beneath real weight, the way it splinters, not all at once, but in protesting layers, was enough to twist the stomach of anyone who understood what they'd just heard. The cane snapped clean, but the break wasn't even. One jagged edge split off and bounced, then spun once before striking Mildred square in the forehead. It wasn't dramatic, just sudden, sharp. A bloom of red appeared right above her eyebrow. Slow at first, then persistent. She didn't cry out, she didn't stumble, but her breath changed. Not shaky, just shorter, quieter, like pain had entered the room and sat down beside her, uninvited but familiar. Kellner didn't apologize. He bent down slowly, mocking slowly, and picked up the two halves of the cane, one in each hand. His gloves creaked as he gripped them tighter, and then, staring straight ahead, he brought his hands together and snapped what remained of the connection in the middle. The sound was fuller this time, a final insult dressed in a death rattle. Then he tossed the pieces. One clattered to the sidewalk. The other landed near the gutter, spinning briefly before coming to rest like something discarded and forgotten. "You done walking yet?" he muttered. His tone coated in sarcasm, slick as oil. "Or you need me to break something else?" His voice wasn't raised. He didn't need to shout. There was power in casual cruelty. In the way he looked at her, not as a person, not even as an obstacle, but as a mistake he was correcting in real time. The crowd that had begun to gather didn't move. Nobody spoke, no gasps, just the hush of disbelief soaked in heat and fear. Kellner turned slightly, scanned the faces, each one a mirror of something he didn't care to see, and smirked. "Didn't think so," he added, eyes daring anyone to say a word. But someone did move. An older man, bent slightly at the spine, stepped from the curb. His shirt was tucked in, his hat was worn. He looked like a grandfather who had seen enough and wasn't afraid of one more bad day. "Hey!" he called out. Voice cracked but steady. "That's assault!" He didn't shout it like a protester. He said it like a fact, like gravity, like the truth that had waited too long to speak up. Kellner turned to face him, all smile gone now. "Step back, old man," he said, low and venomous. "You don't want to be next." He reached for the radio clip to his chest, not to call for help, but to remind everyone that he could. His thumb hovered near the button. "Interfering with law enforcement," he added, "is grounds for arrest, and right now, I'm feeling generous." The older man froze, not out of fear, but calculation, the kind that asks, "Do I want to be the next video or the next headline?" Before he could answer, a new voice broke in, high, young, and sharp like a whistle. "He just broke the law on camera," a kid shouted. "Not more than 12, holding a phone high, the red light is blinking at the top." "Chill, bro, we're live." "He just broke her cane. That's like he just broke the law." "On purpose," a ripple went through the air, not loud but undeniable. Eyes turned toward the child. Kellner turned too. His smirk returned, but now it twitched, cornered, thin. "Put that down, Junior." He said, "You're interfering." The boy didn't flinch. "You broke her cane," he said again, as if naming it gave the moment a gravity it had lacked before. "That's a hate crime, right? I mean, isn't it?" Kellner didn't answer. Mildred still hadn't moved. She stood with blood sliding down the side of her face, thin as thread, but thick with meaning. Her hand was no longer gripping the cane. What was left of it lay at her feet like the bones of a disarmed soldier. Her lips were parted but not to speak. Her eyes stared forward, blind but unyielding. She knew the weight of silence. She had used it like armor before. But this moment wasn't silent. It was thunder, swallowed. The piece of cane near the gutter moved slightly in the wind, rolling just a half-inch, revealing the splintered heart of its break, raw, torn, unfinished. Kellner's boots shuffled as he repositioned himself, hands now idle, unsure. He looked at the old man again, then at the crowd, then at the phone still recording. The scene was too still, too quiet, and in that quiet the truth grew legs. It started walking. It started writing itself. "He didn't even ask her name," the boy muttered to his phone, narrating. "Didn't ask anything. Just snapped it like it was trash, like she was trash, like, damn." Kellner didn't stop him, didn't answer, didn't move. The older man finally stepped back, eyes locked not on the officer but on the woman still standing there. Forehead bleeding, back straight, he bowed his head slightly, respect, apology, maybe prayer, and returned to the sidewalk. Mildred lifted her hand, not fast, not theatrical, just slow enough to wipe the blood from her brow. She used her fingers, bare, wrinkled, and when she looked at them, red staining her skin, she didn't grimace. She just let the hand fall back to her side. Then she stepped forward. No cane, no assistance, just steps. Firm, familiar, unshaken. She passed Kellner without turning her head, without changing her expression, without giving him the dignity of being seen. He didn't stop her, he didn't follow. The crowd watched her walk away, one step, then another. Her balance wasn't perfect, but her direction was. She didn't sway, she didn't falter. Her spine was a straight line of memory and will. She had walked worse roads. This was just another. A child filming let out a breath. "Jill," he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. She didn't even blink. Behind them, the broken cane lay quiet, unfixed, unforgiven. A weapon, a wound, and a witness. The crowd was still breathing in the aftermath, their chests moving slower now, as if the air had grown thicker from what they'd just seen. The broken cane lay on the pavement like evidence that hadn't yet been logged, its jagged edge catching a shimmer of light as if trying to signal something urgent and invisible. Blood still lined the edge of Mrs. Mildred's forehead, dried now at the edges, a thin, red arc, like a quiet signature on the violence that had just been committed and witnessed. But she walked on, her back as upright as it had always been, while the pieces of her cane remained behind, untouched, unclaimed. And then, without sound, without warning, he appeared. From across the street, the cafe door didn't swing open fast. It didn't burst. It moved in a slow arc, a clean hinge without creak or haste. No one noticed at first. No eyes turned toward the figure that stepped out of the shade and into the fringe of daylight. The heat refracted off the sidewalk, warping the edge of his silhouette into something vague at first, more shape than man, until the curve of his shoulders settled against the concrete and the light held still enough to catch the structure of him. Tall, built from quiet tension, he moved like someone who had spent a decade learning how not to move. Every inch of his posture resisted exposition. His arms hung relaxed but never loose. His hands stayed open, not out of passivity, but because they didn't need to be closed to be dangerous. His boots hit the pavement with weight but no sound, landing heel first, then flat, as if the ground was being informed, not asked. He didn't look at her, not once. His eyes, set beneath the lowered angle of a dark brow, remained locked not on the crowd, not on the officer, not even on the blood drying in thin lines against her temple, but on the cane, or rather what was left of it, the two fractured halves. One near the gutter, the other closer to the center of the sidewalk, surrounded by a wide radius of absence, as if even the air had backed away from its brokenness. He stood there for a moment, a full breath longer than necessary. Then he stepped forward. He crossed the street diagonally, ignoring the crosswalk entirely, his path unhurried but undiverted. No one stopped him. Not because they recognized him, no one did, but because something in his approach made the city hold still. The way his body moved inside its silence pulled the edges of the block tighter. Even the wind seemed to reroute around him. He reached the broken cane and stood over it, not bending, not reaching, just hovering, like a final judgment waiting to be delivered. His shadow cut across the cracks in the pavement, slicing through the gap between the two pieces. The crowd watched now, slowly turning, heads pivoting one by one. Some squinted, others froze. One man lowered his phone without realizing it. The figure didn't acknowledge them. His eyes lowered, just slightly, enough to register the fragment near his boot. Then his arm moved, not with effort, but with intention, and the short sleeve of his shirt lifted just enough to reveal the inside of his forearm. A tattoo. Black, sharp, not decorative. It wasn't a brand, but a badge, one that had outlived the unit it marked. It was the kind of insignia born in places the public didn't get to see, where names were less important than numbers, and the cost of decisions was measured in silence. The skin around it was unmarked, no other ink, no scars, just that one symbol, clean and precise, now exposed like a warning. 50 meters down the block, an SUV blinked to life. It was black. No plates, no decals, no glint of authority on the dash, no signal lights to mask its presence as official. But it wasn't subtle, either. It didn't need to be. It rumbled low, thick tires hugging the curb like a threat unspoken. The engine didn't rev, it purred like something sleeping with one eye open. One headlight flicked once, then dimmed. The rear door stayed shut. Inside, behind tinted glass, a shape shifted, but no one got out. The man outside didn't look toward it. He didn't have to. He took one more step forward, closing the distance between himself and the broken cane. His boots lined up with the fragments now, the toe of his left foot resting just an inch from the longer piece. Still, he didn't bend down. He didn't touch it. He just stared. The scene held, stretched taut between movement and meaning. Kellner, who had been standing slightly behind the gathering bystanders, finally moved. His mouth twitched first, unsure whether to curl into confusion or derision. His arms were still at his sides, but his right hand hovered just a bit closer to his belt now. Not to draw. Not yet. But the thought had entered his body like static through a wire. His eyes narrowed. He saw the tattoo, the vehicle, the angle of approach. He didn't speak, but his jaw shifted left to right, the kind of motion that usually comes before a command or a regret. The man didn't blink. A breeze cut through the space between them, lifting a piece of napkin off the ground and tumbling it through the air like a paper ghost. It struck the heel of the boot beside the cane, then floated away. The man didn't notice, or he didn't care. His shoulders stayed squared, hands loose at his sides, fingers steady and still. His breathing was barely visible. Across the street, someone whispered, not loud enough to be heard, but with the rhythm of someone asking, "Who is that?" The question never reached an answer. It dissolved into the ambient pressure now building around the scene. A few feet behind Kellner, a civilian coughed into a sleeve, an accidental punctuation on a sentence no one wanted to start. Still, the man didn't move. He was made of posture now, his silence louder than most protests, his presence more declarative than any badge. He didn't need an introduction. The absence of voice had already become a language. The SUV remained still, its engine humming low, a thin trail of exhaust curled up from its tailpipe, disappearing into the air like breath into fog. Kellner took a half step forward, just one. His boots scraped the pavement, a minor sound that felt too loud in the vacuum the moment had become. His tongue pressed against his cheek. His fingers hovered near the clasp of his holster. He didn't unclip it. He just waited. Then, finally, he blinked. The man's gaze didn't shift. His body didn't change. But the temperature of the street tilted. The space between them no longer belonged to the officer. It had been surrendered, cell by cell. A shift of ownership without motion or paperwork. He had stepped into this block and taken control, not with rank, not with orders, but with gravity. The broken cane stayed where it lay. The man didn't pick it up. He didn't offer comfort or consolation or promise. He didn't need to. By standing, he had said everything. The silence had not lifted. It held the block like a vice, pressing down on the lungs of everyone watching, compressing breath and hesitation into one long, unbearable moment. The man stood still, his presence as massive as stone, yet impossibly more threatening. He hadn't spoken, he hadn't looked at anyone except the shattered cane, but his existence alone was speaking a language the city had forgotten how to answer. Across from him, Officer Kellner stood with his weight slightly back on one heel, fingers flexing near the edge of his belt. He blinked again, as if trying to reassert authority through motion, but it didn't take. The balance had shifted, and though his badge was still visible, and his uniform still crisp, none of it seemed to carry weight now. Not here. Not with him standing across from the man who didn't need to move to make people stop moving. Kellner took a step forward. Not a bold one, a measured one. Calculated for effect, not risk. He positioned himself just far enough that he could speak without shouting, close enough that he could intimidate without touching. The crowd turned their eyes toward him, waiting to see what his badge would try to prove. He let the silence dangle a beat longer, then tilted his head, one corner of his mouth twitching upward into something that could have been a smile if it weren't so venomous. "Step away," he said. It wasn't a request, it wasn't even a command. It was a line thrown like bait. Bait wrapped in authority, dipped in sarcasm. He let the words hang, then followed them with another step. This one was louder, harder, meant to puncture whatever bubble of stillness the man had drawn around himself, but it didn't puncture. It only pressed against it and slid off, weightless. The man didn't move, not even his eyes lifted. Kellner's smile faded, replaced by something harder. His fingers reached for the radio on his shoulder, and he pressed the side button with exaggerated calm. The static crackled into the heat-thickened air, brittle and mechanical. He brought the mic close to his mouth. "This is Unit 247, he said, voice clipped, tone cold enough to draw blood, requesting clearance for use of force. Suspect non-compliant. Engaging perimeter lockdown." The words were routine, hollow, but they carried consequences. That's how the game was played. Ask for permission, not forgiveness. Except this time, he already knew forgiveness wouldn't be coming. Not from the man in front of him. Not from anyone watching. He released the button. The radio buzzed softly in return. No reply yet. Kellner didn't wait. His posture squared, one hand drifting back toward his hip, grazing the latch on his holster. Not opening it. Not yet. Just the warning of it. The gesture was enough to send a ripple through the crowd. A collective inhale. Quick and sharp. They weren't close enough to intervene, but too close to look away. They had seen the cane break, they had seen the blood, and now they were about to see whether power answered for what it did when it thought no one would stop it. The man lifted his chin, that was all. Not a nod, not a lunge, not a challenge, just an inch of movement, enough to catch the edge of the sun across the lines of his jaw. His expression didn't change. His eyes didn't blink, but the space between them contracted, invisible strings pulling tight from every direction. Then he stepped forward, one step, deliberate, absolute. His boot landed just past the line where the cane had broken, heel pressing into the concrete like a signature. He still hadn't spoken. Kellner's jaw twitched. His thumb tapped once against the holster strap. He shifted his stance. Not forward, not back, just enough to suggest readiness. But it wasn't dominance. It was an adjustment, defensive, instinctive, and everyone watching knew it. The step had changed the air. It didn't matter that he hadn't raised a hand. It didn't matter that no words were said. That one step cracked the illusion. It said everything that hadn't been said out loud. I am not afraid of you. I am not impressed by you, and I will not move first. For a moment, nothing else happened. Then, from somewhere in the crowd, low, unsure, but undeniably clear, a voice said, "You picked the wrong guy." It wasn't loud. It wasn't defiant, but it carried. It cut through the static, still whispering from Kellner's radio. It landed like a nail driven into silence, and it stuck. Kellner heard it. He didn't turn his head, but he heard it. His nostrils flared. His hands stayed still, but his body betrayed the smallest recoil. A twitch in the shoulder, a stiffening of the neck. He was standing at the edge of a cliff now, and everyone around him knew it. They weren't sure what they were waiting for. A command, a blow, a mistake, but they could feel the ground shifting beneath the weight of history and pride. The man remained motionless. His body didn't shout. It didn't threaten, but it radiated something Kellner couldn't control, and Kellner knew it. He was standing in full uniform, hand inches from a weapon, with the city's legal muscle behind him, and yet, somehow, he was the one trying to calculate the risk of taking another step. The badge didn't matter here, not in this geometry of stillness, not in this war of angles and restraint. Another breeze slid across the asphalt, this one cooler, whispering around the corners of buildings like it had been sent to cool the heat in someone's blood. The SUV down the block remained motionless. The tinted glass didn't move. The engine idled like a slow heartbeat. And the driver didn't step out. They didn't need to. Their presence was enough to say, "We're here, we see, do what you're going to do, but know that we'll see it." Kellner looked again at the man. No name, no badge, no noise, just posture, just presence. He opened his mouth, as if to say something else, maybe another command, maybe a bluff, but no words came. His throat tightened. Whatever language he had mastered didn't seem to work anymore. It wasn't that the man had taken the power, it was that Kellner had given it away, one threat at a time, until there was nothing left but the echo of what he thought authority was supposed to sound like. Another second passed, another, then two more, and still the man didn't move again. He didn't need to. Kellner lowered his hand. The air hadn't shifted. It had thickened. The crowd still watched, but from farther back now, as if space itself had pulled away from the center of gravity that was quietly forming between two men. Dion hadn't moved since his single step forward, and Kellner had barely held his ground, weapons still holstered, voice caught somewhere between protocol and pride. The street around them held its breath, the fractured pieces of Mildred's cane still scattered across the sidewalk like bones no one dared pick up. The SUV down the block idled in silence. And then, because ego doesn't back down without blood or permission, Kellner made his move. It wasn't dramatic. He didn't lunge or yell. His shoulder dipped just enough and his hand lifted. Not toward a weapon, but in the shape of a push. It wasn't meant to be brutal. It wasn't even meant to leave a mark. It was something far colder, a gesture of erasure, an attempt to reclaim space by making the body in front of him disappear. His palm angled toward Dion's chest, arm tightening in that half-second of motion before contact. But it never landed, because he stopped. His hand froze inches from the fabric, fingers flexed but hanging, trembling in their stillness. Dion didn't flinch. He didn't raise his arms. He didn't blink. But his head turned just slightly, and the weight of that movement alone pulled the floor out from under the moment. His eyes, dark, flat, unshaken, found Kellner's, and something passed between them that didn't need translation. A transfer. A line drawn not with force, but with finality. Kellner's hand hung in the space between intention and consequence. And Dion spoke. His voice wasn't loud, it wasn't theatrical, it wasn't dressed in rage or wrapped in threat. It was clean, sharp, surgical. "If you touch her again," he said, "you better make sure it's the last thing you do while standing." That was it. No shouting, no growl. Just a sentence, dropped like a straight blade onto a table that had only seen blunt instruments. The silence after was total. It didn't ask for a response. It didn't wait for one. It landed, cut, and stayed there, embedded in the air between them. Kellner's face twitched. A flicker of disbelief or fear or both. His hand lowered slowly, fingers uncoiling like something that had briefly forgotten it wasn't in control anymore. He took half a breath, didn't finish it, stepped back, not fast, not slow, but measured, as if unsure if the ground behind him still belonged to him. Behind them, a sound cracked through the tension, not words, not sirens. It was the sound of knees buckling, a shuffle, a breath caught in the throat. Mildred. She had stopped moving 10 feet away, near the edge of the sidewalk, eyes fixed forward though sightless, spine still upright. But now her legs gave, just slightly, not from fear, not from pain, from exhaustion so old it had become habit. The day's weight, the years beneath it, had all decided to rest on her bones at once. She staggered, one foot slipping unevenly against the concrete, and Dion moved, fast but not panicked, controlled. His arm came up, not reaching, not grabbing, just extending with the precision of muscle memory, trained in situations where seconds meant survival. He reached her side in a heartbeat, one hand steadying her elbow, the other open, palm up, hovering in front of her like a bridge she could choose to cross or not. She didn't hesitate. Her hand found his with the certainty of someone who had held it before, long ago, in smaller, gentler moments that had nothing to do with threats or concrete or blood. He didn't speak, neither did he, but the moment locked into place, carved from gravity and ritual. Dion's hand curled around hers, not tightly, not possessively, but with just enough strength to steady her without suggesting she needed to be held up. She straightened, slowly, her posture recovering by degrees. He stood beside her, not blocking her, not shielding her, just present, and that was when it showed. The movement was unintentional, barely perceptible. As his shoulder rolled back to recenter her balance, the fold of his shirt lifted an inch near the collarbone. The fabric slid across skin, revealing a glimpse beneath the edge of his open collar. A metal glint, not decorative, not loud. A badge, but not quite. Just a hint of it. A clipped triangle of matte-finished steel, half-concealed, the lettering unreadable from this distance, the meaning not yet off. But to the trained eye, or the fearful one, it was enough. Enough to question everything they thought they knew about the man in front of them. Kellner saw it. He squinted, jaw tightening, trying to decipher what had just shown itself, but it was gone just as quickly, the fabric falling back into place, as if the moment had never happened. No one else saw, no one else needed to. Dion didn't move again. His hand remained where it was, her fingers still resting against his palm. His expression hadn't changed, but the space around them had. It was no longer tension, it was command. Kellner's breathing had gone shallow, not from exertion, from adjustment. He looked down at his hands, then up again. He opened his mouth, thought better of it, and closed it without a sound. His feet stayed still. The crowd, which had fallen into a hush so deep it bordered on reverence, didn't step forward, didn't clap, didn't speak. But in their eyes, something had changed. This was no longer an officer and a civilian. This was something else, something older than authority and more precise than violence. The SUV down the street remained parked, engine on. No movement. Dion didn't look at it. He didn't look at anything but the woman beside him. And still, not one word more, because one sentence had been enough. The hand that had steadied Mildred fell away like a switchblade snapping shut. Efficient, silent, final. Dion didn't look back at her, nor at Kellner, nor at the growing wall of onlookers. He shifted his stance slightly, like a satellite adjusting orbit, then moved his eyes, not his head, toward his palm. The phone was already there, no flourish, no hesitation. He tapped 3 digits. Not an emergency, not public, something quieter, meaner, the kind of number that doesn't show up on records but changes them. He pressed send. The line clicked twice. Then a voice answered, genderless, expressionless, go. His reply was surgical. 113B, nothing more. No ID, no call sign, no need. The line paused, then returned with all the warmth of steel against bone. Authorized, protocol open. You have 27. Click. Dead air. No follow-up. No name. Just the sound of obedience baked into brevity. Dion slid the phone away like it had never existed. Across the street, Kellner didn't blink, but his feet adjusted. The subtle stutter of a man who'd heard a language he wasn't meant to understand. He glanced at the SUV, still parked 50 meters down, still silent. Then its blinker lit up once, slow and precise, a single amber eye opening to confirm it had seen the signal. It didn't move immediately. It didn't need to. The message had already been sent. Movement authorized, containment in progress. The crowd leaned forward like a tide drawn toward some gravitational certainty. Their phones rose, their breathing slowed. Someone muttered something under their breath, but it didn't matter. No one heard. No one interrupted. The SUV shifted forward. No engine growl, no screech, just mass in motion, deliberate and deadly. Its matte deck chassis skimmed the double line with military grace, wheels aligned like chess pieces moved by the end of a game. Dion didn't look back at it. He didn't acknowledge it at all. He just stepped aside half a foot, subtle clearance, enough to let the vehicle know the perimeter was live. Behind him, Kellner adjusted his stance again, one hand twitching near his belt, unsure if this was escalation or eradication. His mouth opened, then closed. He didn't have the right words, because the moment didn't want them. The SUV slowed as it reached visual range. One headlight flashed once. It wasn't signaling a turn, it was marking position, like a scope locking target. No doors opened, no tinted windows rolled down. It just sat there, waiting for the next node in a sequence only a few people alive had clearance to read. That's when the crowd broke, not with volume, but with meaning. A woman near the front, hair wind-messed, holding a child too tight, said the thing that everyone else was too afraid to voice. "If the FBI moves like this," she whispered, more to herself than the air, either something's very wrong, or someone finally got it right. No one responded. They didn't need to. The silence was answer enough. Dion didn't speak. He didn't flinch. His breathing was steady. His presence a locked file no one dared decrypt. The SUV waited. The street held. The protocol had started. The SUV didn't have to stay. The message had already been delivered, and the protocol had already moved on. As the crowd dissolved, as Kellner held his silence like a sinking ship grips its final breath, Dion moved back into the shadows. The phone was in his hand again before anyone noticed. This time there was no call, no voice. just code. His fingers slid across the screen with the efficiency of someone who didn't guess, didn't search, didn't hope. He already knew what to find. He was just here to open the vault. 4 minutes later, in a locked room 3,000 miles away, a red flag query triggered a dormant node in a private server once linked to a suspended federal archive. Access required no password. The clearance had never expired. It simply hadn't been used in over 7 years. The search phrase was simple: Kellner, Matthew J. The file populated in silence. 3 prior disciplinary incidents, internal use only. The language was uniform, sterile, clipped, padded with procedural code. Entry 1. Unlawful use of force during the detainment of a civilian suspect. The victim suffered a fractured wrist. The Internal Affairs report recommended a 2-week unpaid suspension. Final action. Verbal warning. Notes. No video footage. Discrepancies in witness testimony. Status. Closed. Entry to de-escalate during neighborhood patrol. The suspect was 16 years old. Outcome: contusion, temporary hearing loss from proximity to flashbang. The officer claimed standard riot protocol. IA concluded insufficient deviation from policy. Status: resolved, no penalty. Entry 3. Conduct unbecoming, submitted anonymously. Attached media file. JPEG 224 KB. The image loaded slowly at first, washed with compression artifacts and dim lighting, but the subject was unmistakable. Kellner, uniformed, standing at the rear of a patrol cruiser, smirking at the camera, both hands resting on his duty belt. Behind him, on the ground, barely in frame, a young black man, bleeding from the temple, one hand cuffed, eyes swollen shut, no visible motion. The timestamp read 3:14 a.m., October 9th, 2014. Internal comments followed. Photo captured by former ride-along trainee, not released publicly. Incident reviewed under jurisdictional discretion. Then the email trail began. From redact at citydispatch.gov to redact at Internal Control Gov. Heading: the subject entered at midnight. To recommend no further review. He's clean where it counts. His old man was the regional commander. No point digging holes, we'll have to explain to Congress later. Second reply, 2 hours later. From at chiefsupnet to at red dot. Subject: confirmed, agreed. He's messy but manageable. Keep eyes on him, but don't clip his wings unless he crashes. None of these messages was encrypted. None were flagged. They'd simply sat there for years, behind clearance gates and the comfort of bureaucracy, until now. Dion read them once, and he bundled the files. 1 folder, 4 items. He encrypted them under a fresh keychain set to expire in 90 minutes unless manually renewed. The subject line of the outgoing message was empty. The recipient field wasn't. 2. legal.intake@naacp.org. Attachment: per public interest and internal failure to act submission. Message: per public interest and internal failure to act. Submission: timestamp. He didn't add his name. He didn't need to. The packet spoke for itself. The digital fingerprint had been scrubbed, routed through 3 air-gapped networks, and a dead mailbox registered to a shuttered Veteran Affairs clinic. The press wouldn't receive it first. The law would. Then the people who knew what to do with the law when it failed to keep itself clean. Dion closed the screen. The phone powered down. The data logs dated back 12 years. Dion didn't need them all. He moved through directories like a scalpel through scar tissue, bypassing incident summaries, skipping court transcripts, ignoring anything redacted for public inquiry. This wasn't about what had been said under oath. This was about what had never been meant for eyes beyond the command structure. He found the first notation under a field tag labeled Known Asset Proximity. It was a subfolder, buried deep, linked to Kellner's personnel jacket. Access: Internal Affairs only. Status: restricted. Notation: subject has maintained shielded disciplinary standing due to paternal association with former Command Chief J. Kellner. REIT 2009. Subject placed on soft immunity track per verbal authorization. Informal flag issued. Do not initiate Tier 3 review unless incident involves federal-level media traction. Another note, time-stamped 2017, read, "Recommendation to reassign M. Kellner to back-action duty denied. Performance review manipulated by district HR liaison per private request. Reason undisclosed." Then came the attachments. Exhibit C-17, Officer Body Cam Audit, Accidental Corruption, 3 different video IDs linked to 3 unrelated stops, all conducted by Kellner, all flagged missing. Audit note, device failure pattern suggests intentional wipe. No disciplinary action taken. Exhibit F9, Community Complaint Archive, 17 reports filed under Public Conduct. Language across multiple submissions repeated the phrases hostile tone, racialized language, and excessive intimidation. Resolution status, insufficient evidence, no follow-ups. Timestamped, auto-closed in batch. Exhibit G2, Officer Psychological Evaluation. Redacted. Summary line visible. Subject exhibits measurable impulse repression issues. Recommends quarterly monitoring. The evaluation expired 3 years ago. No update since. All of it was quiet, archived, dormant. Until now, Dion didn't lift a brow. He'd just saved what mattered. The image, the emails, the soft flags, the audio gaps, the patterns. He wrote no summary. He added no commentary. He did not narrate injustice. He forwarded it. The packet was reassembled, compressed, and key-locked. He didn't name the folder. He didn't need to. Its weight was built into the bytes. When he sent it to the NASAP legal intake, he did not include timestamps in the message. He did not tag the city. The body of the email simply read, "Enclosed. Evidence suppressed under legacy nepotism agreements. Status, overdue." Then he sent it and deleted the local copy. The system would hold it for 4 hours before purging. Long enough, loud enough. The law had failed upward, now it would fall the same way. The file had been sent quietly, but the world didn't answer quietly. What began as a silent forward to a legal inbox detonated 12 hours later, first as a whisper, then a surge. The dash cam footage was the spark, not the main video everyone had seen already, the one with the cane crushed beneath a boot, but the secondary angle, forgotten until someone with clearance scrubbed the audio clean. It caught Kellner's voice, low and unrepentant. "She should be grateful I didn't shove her under a It wasn't shouted, it wasn't said in anger, it was muttered, flat and habitual, like the punchline to a joke no one should ever tell out loud. The moment hit the internet like a split atom. Within the hour, it clipped itself into a 15-second video and landed on Twitter with one tag: Broken Cane Justice. By sunrise, it was trending. By mid-morning, it was #1. Not just viral, weaponized. It spread across feeds like a blood stain on white cloth. No need for narration. No context necessary. It showed everything. The stomp, the silence, the slur. No edits, no filters. Just a woman who could not see, a man who chose not to be seen, and a sidewalk that refused to forget. Tweets multiplied, fast and vicious. Reaction videos followed, then threads from lawyers, historians, parents, veterans, and teenagers. One line cut through them all. First anonymous, then cited in courtrooms, classrooms. Captions beneath stills from the video. One broken cane, one broken system, and one man who didn't blink. It came from a lawyer. No name, no press release, just the line. It was printed on protest signs within 2 days, on shirts by day 3, on building walls by the end of the week. The media called it a movement, but it wasn't a movement. It was proof. Kellner's name wasn't trending. The hashtag was. He wasn't the villain. He was the proof of one. The video didn't just call him out. It erased him. In the comment sections, no one asked who he was. They asked how long the city had known, how deep it went, how much worse it had to get before someone would have stopped him if no camera had been rolling. The clip hit Instagram Reels, then TikTok, found its way into stitched testimonies from people across the country, students, bus drivers, veterans, mothers, each holding a phone to their face and starting their own stories with, "It wasn't a cane, it was my," and they filled in the blank, "backpack, hijab, accent, Skin. The international press followed fast. BBC, Al Jazeera, France 24, Deutsche Welle, no opinion pieces. Just headlines like flashbangs, hashtag shakes U.S. system, officer caught on video, sparks national outcry. Footage raises global eyebrows over American policing. The footage did what hearings hadn't. It made them look, and it made them ask, who was the man standing next to her? The one who didn't speak, the one who didn't raise his voice or his fists, but made the badge stop moving. He wasn't in the hashtag, he wasn't in the story, but he was in every eye that watched it. And that silence, one he held, spoke louder than any reply. The silence that followed the viral storm didn't last long. What began as hashtags and headlines soon filled inboxes, flooded switchboards, and finally marched into City Hall in flesh and voice. The emergency city council session wasn't meant to be public, but pressure has a way of finding cracks. The agenda leaked. Then the vote to close the doors leaked, and by the time the cameras were finally allowed in, the damage control was already behind schedule. The room was full, not with bureaucrats or consultants, but with residents, tired, alert, unapologetically present. The dais looked smaller under the lights. 12 counselors sat behind mics that made their breathing audible and their silence louder. They opened with procedural gestures, a parade of acknowledgments and commitments to transparency, but the audience wasn't there for pledges. They were there for names, for actions, for consequences. The first question came from a man in the fourth row. Gerard Campbell, grocery store owner. He stood slowly, spoke more slowly. How many complaints does it take for a badge to break? The answer never came. Just phrases like review thresholds and internal discretion, the kind of phrases that float until someone asks something heavier. That someone was a little girl, maybe 9. Standing beside her grandmother, she asked in a clear, unshaking voice, "Why did the police hit the blind lady?" The chamber fell completely still. One counselor looked down. Another turned off their mic. The chairwoman hesitated, glanced toward legal counsel, but said nothing. The girl tried again. "If she can't see, how is she dangerous?" The words weren't loud, but sharp enough to open the room like a wound. Then came the voice of a high school principal, not on the list, not angry, just steady. "Who's been protecting Officer Kellner for 10 years? The weight of the question flattened the table. No one tried to answer it. Not the commissioner, not the mayor's liaison, not even the chairperson, whose fingers gripped the edge of her podium like it might float her out of the room. The principal's follow-up was even quieter. 3 filed reports, dismissed, internal referrals, buried, video footage ignored, promotions maintained. Are we still calling that oversight or policy? The city attorney leaned in to whisper something legal into an accidentally hot microphone. No one heard the words. Everyone heard the tone. Then, from the back of the room, one last voice, no podium, no mic. Just a single sentence that felt like a gavel dropped on a neck. Why should we trust the response if it comes from the same seat that ignored the first complaint? The room didn't erupt. It didn't have to. The message was already clear. This wasn't about one man with a badge anymore. It was about the chair he sat under, and the hands that had steadied it for years while pretending not to feel the weight. The silence in the chamber didn't end with applause or outrage. It ended the way tectonic plates move, slow, grinding, silent, until something finally breaks. And when it broke, it didn't do so with sirens. It slipped under the doors, through the vents, inside sealed envelopes and encrypted memos. By morning, the commissioner's office was locked. By noon, the chief of police had resigned. There was no press conference, no camera, no handshake, no uniform, just a sealed envelope hand-delivered to the mayor's office, signed with a real pen, dated in neat block letters, and stamped with the departmental crest. The letter itself was never released, but someone inside the city records confirmed its existence. It had 3 lines. The first said he was stepping down. The second cited preservation of institutional focus. The third, in handwriting slightly different from the rest, read, "Do not contact me further." That same night, Kellner was moved. It didn't happen publicly. It wasn't booked into standard systems. There was no mugshot, no perp walk, no bond hearing, just a line added to an internal log. Relocation 4:43 a.m. Federal custody hold. No detail, no agency named. The building he was taken from had no badge on the door. The man who signed the transfer form had no nameplate. The only record of it was a timestamp from an internal scanner, one that by policy was supposed to erase pings after 90 minutes. This one didn't. Dion received the alert at 4:57 IEM. It wasn't a message. It was a signature, encoded, pre-agreed, a blinking dot that said they moved him, quietly, someone still protecting him. He didn't need to ask who. He just sat with the information, let the clock run 5 minutes, then opened a second folder he'd never planned to use. It had only one document, a two-word contact buried in metadata. Its label wasn't a name. It was a question. When, not if. He didn't send it, not yet. By 8:10 a.m., another file dropped. This one came from a journalist who didn't realize what she'd received. It was meant for a different address, bounced by a firewall, then flagged by a scraper looking for geomarked files. Inside, a map, high resolution, labeled by grid. At first glance, it looked like a zoning chart. At second glance, it wasn't. It marked neighborhoods, not by infrastructure, not by crime rate, but by race. Specifically, density, areas of concentration, heightened probability, and low assimilation markers. All red. No names, no humans, just color codes, just percentages. The source of the map was obscured, the metadata stripped, but the format was unmistakable. It was a departmental planning map, internal, and no one had ever admitted it existed. The leak spread in silence. It didn't trend, it didn't go viral, it circulated like poison, quiet, invisible, lethal. Dion read the legend. He didn't blink. Then he looked at the date in the corner. It was 6 years old, which meant it had been used. Which meant it might still be. At 9:22 IMing, his phone vibrated once. A single message. No name, just, "They will retaliate. Watch your 6." He closed the screen. He didn't respond. There was no statement from him, no post, no press, but those around him began to move. One lawyer forwarded the map to 2 advocacy groups. One archivist matched the format to a 2016 training document used by a now-defunct task force. One teacher started marking off red zones near her school. One volunteer set up a signal line in case federal intervention shifted direction. Dion didn't tell them to do any of that. He just waited. And while he waited, the air in City Hall changed. Security doubled. Access to files was restricted. Memos stopped being printed. Staffers walked with their eyes down, their whispers fast. A building that had been filled with noise now echoed like a bunker, not because they were hiding, because they knew someone had been watching all along and hadn't blinked. The city didn't state the resignation. They let the headlines do the talking and the silence do the rest. Rumors filled the gap like water rushing into an exposed vein. Some said the chief had booked a one-way flight hours before the letter reached the mayor's office. Others claimed he was seen at a private airstrip, no luggage, no entourage, just a duffel bag and a gray overcoat, zipped to the collar. One reporter swore she saw him speaking to a man who looked federal but wore no insignia, no badge, only a black tie and a bored expression. The airport security logs for that morning disappeared by the afternoon. But Dion didn't chase rumors, he followed trails. Quiet ones. The kind hidden inside logs no one thought to encrypt because they assumed no one would dig that deep. He found a terminal ping from a building 2 blocks off Capitol Street, registered under a dummy permit for a communications subcontractor that had been inactive since 2019. The device ID matched a file he'd seen once, long ago, back when he still wore a badge and pretended it meant something clean. The signal was a handoff. Someone important had walked out a back door and someone powerful had made sure it left no echo. Still, the map. The thing about maps is they're not stories, they're declarations. You don't argue with a map, you read it. You see what it chooses to include, what it decides to name, what it marks in red. And this one said something loud. even though it had no voice. It said, "We know where you live. We've been counting." And more than that, it said, "We were preparing for something." What that something was, no one yet knew. But the design of the map wasn't passive. It wasn't surveillance for protection. It was calculus for pressure. Dion knew the difference. You don't color code density by racial identifiers unless you're looking to define containment, impact zones, or deployment criteria. That's not risk management. That's targeting. He didn't send the map to the press. He sent it to the people who could recognize the format and the pattern. 2 retired analysts, one federal, one state, both off the record, both long divorced from the glory of badge or flag. One replied with 3 words, "It was real." The other replied with none, only a document attachment, a briefing from 2017 outlining expected behavioral clustering among vulnerable demographics during public unrest. The phrase "controlled interaction vector" was underlined 3 times. That was all he needed. Kellner's silence wasn't an accident. It was insulation. He wasn't being hidden because he was a scapegoat. He was being hidden because he was a threat. And pulling him too hard risked unraveling more than one agency's memory. Someone had stepped in, not to rescue him, but to bury the access point. Meanwhile, the letter. The resignation was a symptom, not a confession. It didn't fix anything. It was a flag, white flag, but not a surrender. More like a signal to the other side of the system, "I'm out, you're next." Dion knew what that meant. It meant someone had calculated exposure, had decided the cost of keeping Kellner in daylight was now higher than the cost of letting him rot in shadow. It meant the system wasn't crumbling, it was retreating, rerouting. The retaliation wouldn't come like a bullet. It wouldn't wear boots or shout orders. It would come quietly. Policy changes, frozen funding, relocated allies, slow walks down long halls where answers used to live. So he moved first. He activated a secondary drop network, one built not for leaks but for verification. A chain of handlers across multiple jurisdictions, not journalists, not politicians, archivists, coders, analysts, people who didn't need credit, only accuracy. He sent them fragments, names, time codes, building schematics, case logs, historical outliers. No instructions, just packets. They'd know what to do. And they did. One located the original internal memo that accompanied the map, buried in a departmental archive under a mislabeled training seminar. Another traced a paper trail of Kellner's commendations, 3 of which had been signed off by the now resigned chief within 48 hours of filed complaints. A third found an audit note, an unsent report recommending the dissolution of a tactical unit Kellner had once trained with. The recommendation had been overwritten by urgent resource repurposing. All of it pointed in the same direction. They hadn't just protected him, they had used him. And now they were done. Dion didn't call for protests. He didn't show up at meetings. He didn't speak to the cameras or craft statements. He just continued pulling, not loud, not fast, but with precision. And with every piece that fell loose, the machine behind the man looked less like law and more like design. The truth wasn't screaming. It was leaking, and the leak wasn't water. It was oil. And something, somewhere, was already holding a match. The oil was still leaking. The silence is still thick, but the ground had already begun to crack, and when it did, it didn't split under pressure from the present. It split because of something buried deep, old, and alive. His name was Tyrone Winslow, and 10 years ago he had learned exactly how quiet the law could be when it didn't want to listen. Now he was the one who made the silence flinch. He didn't walk in with lawyers. He didn't come with a crowd. He entered the building alone, carrying only a slim folder and the calm of someone who had already made peace with what it would cost him to speak. The hallway outside the district integrity office was cold, fluorescent lit, and silent. 3 steps before the security desk, he looked the guard in the eyes and said, "I'm not here for protection. I'm here for the record." The guard nodded. No clipboard, no questions. He already knew who Tyrone was. Everyone did. 10 years earlier, his name had never made the report. His nose had. So had the blood, the bruised ribs, and the torn t-shirt. But the officer had been Kilner. The shirt had read, "Justice for Jamal," and the story had ended before it even started. Back then, Tyrone had filed the complaint. They'd taken his statement. Then they'd told him there was no footage, no body cam, no third-party witnesses. The department had called it an unfortunate altercation during dispersal protocol. No internal action was taken, and Tyrone, who was 22 then and still believed there was a line between wrong and illegal, went home and didn't speak again. But time doesn't bury injustice. It compresses it. And 10 years later he returned, not to rage, he'd done that in private, but to testify. Inside the room there were only 4 people: a legal intake officer, a civil rights observer, a transcriber, and Dion sitting in the back corner, not as a cop, not as a handler, just as a presence. Tyrone didn't look at him. He didn't need to. The moment was bigger than either of them. He placed the folder on the table. Inside, one photo, taken on a flip phone, blurry, angled, but clear enough. His nose was bent at the wrong angle. His face was swollen on one side, and the shirt, white with black stencil text, blood, across the word justice. They didn't ask him to speak. He began anyway. "I didn't come here to remember," he said. "I remember fine. I came here to make sure you do." He explained how it happened. Not with drama, not with tears, just facts. He'd been walking home from a vigil, candle still burning, the shirt is still clean. There had been officers along the side of the street, pushing people to the sidewalk. Kellner hadn't said anything. He just stepped out, grabbed Tyrone by the collar, and drove his face into the wall. No warning, no orders, just contact. "I asked him why," Tyrone said. "He told me I was provoking public disorder with a political garment." He paused. "I didn't know cotton could provoke fear." The room didn't move. He continued. "I thought the worst part was the nose, or the way he laughed when I tried to stand up, but that wasn't it. The worst part was the form they made me sign after. Voluntary medical refusal. Like if I didn't check that box, I'd spend the night in a set." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't shake. He didn't ask for an apology. He gave them what they had never wanted, a record. Then he added the line that would end up in every article, every court filing, every conversation about what systems choose to see. "I'm not blind, but that night, I didn't see justice either. That was it. No applause, no hugs, no cameras, just a form, signed, and a silence so sharp it might as well have been broken glass on tile. The weight of testimony never falls all at once. It spreads, like slow water through dry cracks. And sometimes it doesn't hit hardest when the truth is told, but when the system responds to it. Tyrone's words had landed with force, but it was what followed, what institutions scrambled to salvage. That spoke loudest. Dion was called into a room he didn't want to enter. There were men in suits, not enemies, not allies, officers of order, fluent in protocol, allergic to consequence. They didn't wear badges, but they carried the same weight. Men who didn't bleed for the public, but managed its optics like currency. The offer was delivered with practiced calm, rehearsed civility, and a thin undercurrent of command. It was a compromise, they said, a path forward. "We want to protect the integrity of the unit," one of them said, his fingers laced loosely on the table like a man avoiding a poker towel. "The Bureau's reputation matters. Yours does too." Another chimed in with the carrot. "There's no need for escalation. We can recognize what happened without lighting fires." The terms were simple. The department would issue a formal statement of regret. Mildred would receive a public apology. There would be no admission of guilt, no liability, just a gesture. It would be filmed, respectful and dignified. She wouldn't have to say anything, just stand there, just receive. The words were careful, their tone is even more so. It wasn't a threat, not quite, but it wasn't a gift either. It was an exit sign above a burning hallway. Take the deal. Let the system say sorry on its terms. Let the storm pass with a bow and a smile. Dion didn't answer. He didn't ask for clarification. He simply stood, not at once, not in agreement, but acknowledgement, and left the room without shaking a hand. Outside, the hallway felt colder, the walls tighter. He walked without purpose until his phone buzzed with a message he hadn't seen in days. It was from the nurse who checked on his mother weekly. Mildred had refused medication that morning, said her head was too clear for chemicals. He turned back toward the exit. No cameras were waiting, no headlines in the air, just the sound of his shoes against old tile and the pull of something he didn't owe the system but owed her. He didn't tell her everything when he got home. He didn't need to. Mildred was seated in her usual spot by the window, hands folded in her lap, head tilted ever so slightly like she was listening to the floor beneath the floor. He recounted the proposal, what they wanted, what would it look like, how clean it could be. She didn't speak immediately. She didn't ask questions. She just sat with it, letting the silence settle like a coat over something old and already known. Then she turned her head, slow and deliberate, and said, "I don't need an apology." Dion waited, not because he expected more, but because she wasn't done. Her voice stayed low, steady. "I need them to never do it to my daughter." And that was all she said. Dion didn't respond. He let her words hang, unchallenged, undeniable. She didn't need to be coaxed or counseled. Her clarity was sharp enough to slice through every polished offer that had been made behind closed doors. Meanwhile, the machine spun on. Communications teams wrote scripts disguised as sincerity. Legal aides tested sentences against precedent. A date was penciled in, a stage order, a seal is printed. Somewhere downtown, a media consultant rehearsed the optics of forgiveness, complete with angles, applause, and well-lit regret, but they never called it performance. They called it healing. Mildred never responded, and that silence was louder than any press release. The phone calls kept coming. Producers, journalists, writers with open slots and pre-written sympathy, each had their version of "we want to help her speak." Some led with respect, others cloaked manipulation in soft tones and careful phrasing, but all of them missed the same truth. Mildred didn't need a stage. She'd already survived the storm. Dion handled what he could, declined what he must, but one crew came anyway. The woman at the gate stood poised, shoulders square, mic in hand, voice tuned to the pitch of public concern. "We'd love to hear her story," she said, with the rehearsed cadence of someone who believed her lens made her an ally. "People are listening now. This moment matters." Dion didn't answer immediately. He looked back through the screen door, toward the figure beyond the curtain. She was waiting, not for permission, but for the noise to come close enough. He opened the door. Mildred stood. Her movement was slow, deliberate, and not weak. She didn't ask who it was. She already knew. She stepped into the doorway, fingers brushing the frame like reading braille from wood. The reporter lifted the mic, softening her voice. "Mrs. Winslow, would you be willing to share what you're feeling?" she asked, smile tightening like she'd already rehearsed the segment. "The public wants—" "They don't need to hear me," Mildred said, her voice quiet but absolute. "They need to hear themselves." The air hung still after she spoke, not with awkwardness, but with finality, the kind that didn't ask for comprehension, the kind that simply announced itself and left no room to be negotiated. The reporter stood frozen for half a beat, mic lowered, her mouth slightly parted, as if unsure whether to push forward or retreat. But Mildred had already turned away. She didn't slam the door. She didn't need to. The soft click of it closing was louder than any denial. It was not rejection, it was a refusal. Dion didn't watch her walk back inside. He stayed on the porch, watching the car idle in the street. The cameraman already shutting down the feed, the reporter still standing like a script had just betrayed her. Eventually, they left. Not angry, not victorious, just small, as if reduced to the size of their assumptions. Inside, the house was quiet. Mildred had resumed her seat by the window, her fingers tracing that same invisible rhythm on the wood grain. Dion sat across from her, the space between them a quiet contract. He thought about the men in suits. He thought about the offer, and then he thought about how nothing they could orchestrate would ever match the gravity of what she had just said with one sentence and a closed door. Somewhere, a press release was being rewritten. Somewhere else, a legal assistant crossed out the phrase mutually agreed resolution. And in rooms Dion would never be invited into, conversations shifted from control to concern. Not fear, just recognition. The story could no longer be steered, that Mildred, without a microphone or spotlight, had told the system exactly where it could place its apology, and it wasn't on her doorstep. She hadn't rejected the gesture. She had rendered it irrelevant. Later that evening, Dion received another call. It was brief. A familiar voice, one that had spoken to him before with calculated warmth. Now it was cooler. "She's not going to play along?" the voice asked. "No," Dion said. A pause. Then, "This won't end clean. It wasn't clean to begin with," Dion replied. Click. The call ended. No threats, just confirmation. The call hadn't been loud. It didn't come with threats or ultimatums. It arrived in the form of silence. Controlled, intentional, the kind of institutions use when they're speaking clearly without saying anything at all. Dion recognized the tone instantly. He'd heard it before, in briefings where discomfort was dressed as protocol, in boardrooms where decisions were made without names. Now it was following him, in calendar changes, in meetings that lasted just long enough to feel scripted, in words like trajectory, optics, and unit cohesion. They weren't expelling him. They were building a door and hoping he'd choose to walk through it on his own. One deputy director offered him a break. Unofficial, low profile, full pay. Another asked if he'd like to shift his focus toward internal systems realignment. The meaning was simple: step away or be marked. Not officially, not in any file, but in the unspoken chain of trust where careers are made or lost. Not by action, but by who you make uncomfortable. Dion saw it. The Bureau didn't want blood. They wanted silence. They didn't want him broken. They wanted him to be docile. And when he didn't yield, the next phase began. Colleagues stopped making eye contact. Some nodded with tight smiles. Others simply vanished into inboxes. Conversation dried up. Doors stayed closed. But pressure doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it hands you a seat and asks if you'd prefer to step down with dignity. Sometimes it gives you a choice that isn't one at all. In a hallway no longer used for anything official, Dion passed a man who had once mentored him. The older agent didn't stop walking, just said, low and even, "You know how many black agents get this far?" Dion replied, "Few." The man added, "And fewer still stay clean if they start asking questions." That was the break. Not because it revealed something Dion didn't already know, but because it confirmed what had hardened in him over weeks of delay, avoidance, and orchestrated quiet. He wasn't being invited to protect something. He was being asked to surrender. Not just the case, himself. The next day, he received a call marked internal only, routed through a secure channel, short and without preamble. The voice belonged to a man 3 ranks above him, one of the Bureau's prized neutral minds, the kind that moved between divisions like shadow, untouchable but ever present. "You've done good work," the voice said, each word balanced like it had been reviewed by legal. "We're aware of your record. We also understand. Strong convictions. But this situation is becoming a point of focus." The word focus landed like a veiled scalpel. Dion didn't interrupt. The voice continued. "There are channels for this, trusted lanes. What we ask is that you consider the long-term implications of continuing this particular involvement. Not because we disagree with your concerns, but because exposure doesn't always lead to reform. Sometimes it only leads to isolation." The call ended without a request. Just a tone, just a weight, just the same subtle gravity every institution wields when it wants to disarm without drawing a weapon. Later that evening in the field office locker room, a younger agent sat beside him in silence for a long minute before finally speaking. "I heard they offered you a chance to transfer out of this. I mean, that's rare." Dion didn't reply. The agent hesitated, then lowered his voice. "You know, There are guys upstairs wondering why you're pushing this. Some are saying it's personal. Dion turned to him. And? The agent flushed. And I mean, sure, maybe it is. I'd get it. It just, you've got more to lose than most. There aren't a lot of us with your clearance. Your record, you throw that away, it's not just yours. Dion stood up. Then they shouldn't have handed it to the wrong one. That night he reviewed the Kellner file one last time, not to add to it, not to strategize, but to look it in the eye. The ink hadn't changed. The patterns were the same. The silence remained official, and in every line he saw not just injustice, but architecture. Lines built to hold weight, not to bend. He placed the file flat on the desk. Then he turned to the other drawer, the one with no label. Inside it was a form he'd never wanted to use, a formal statement of withdrawal from lead investigative responsibility. He left the signature blank, not because he doubted the decision, but because once his name touched that paper, there would be no stepping back. The next morning, the decision stopped being theoretical. He was called in, not to be reprimanded, not yet, but to be spoken to, again. Higher this time. A conference room 6 floors above his clearance level. The walls were lined with certificates and silence. The men across the table weren't overtly hostile. They weren't careless either. They were exact. Bureau men, career men, not enemies, but not allies either. We know your background, one of them began. Your record's clean, impressive. But this push, you must know how it's being seen, another added, not just in the press. Internally, among donors, policy circles. It's being read as antagonism. Dion kept his posture neutral. He didn't blink. Truth isn't antagonistic, he said. It's just inconvenient when it's late. One of them exhaled sharply through his nose. Agent Winslow, we brought you here because there's still a future. You've built something. But if you go further, if you keep pressing this, some doors don't reopen. The room paused. Then, without shifting in his seat, Dion said, then maybe those doors weren't meant to be walked through. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was clinical, something measured, dissected, and filed away for future strategy. They didn't argue, they didn't raise their voices, they simply looked at one another, then down at the table, as if the outcome had already been written, and in some way it had. Back at his desk, Dion stared at the form he had left unsigned the night before. The line for his name was still blank. But now it didn't feel like surrender. It felt like a declaration, not of failure, but of choice. He picked up the pen, signed once, clean, without hesitation. He walked the document to his direct superior. No explanation. No emotion, just the paper, handed over like a weapon laid down, not in defeat, but in clarity. The man looked at the form, then at Dion. You sure about this? He asked. Dion nodded. If the system needs me to stay silent to keep my badge, then I'm wearing the wrong one. The man didn't press. He just set the paper down beside him and said, you know, most people who quit cases like this do it to save themselves, not to save their voice. Dion didn't respond. He didn't need to. He'd already said everything by choosing to stop saying what they wanted to hear. He didn't clean out his office that day. He didn't need to. Stepping back from a case wasn't a resignation. It wasn't even an act of rebellion. It was an act of redefinition. And for Dion, it meant freedom. Freedom from protocol disguised as principle, from conversations shaped like questions but loaded like warnings. He walked through the building as he always had, straight, controlled, unreadable. But this time, he no longer felt like a part of it. He felt like a witness to it. A man who knew the shape of its insides but no longer needed to live there. No one stopped him. Some glanced up, a few looked away, and one, a woman from accounting who had never spoken more than a good morning, met his eyes and nodded, not in approval, not in pity, but in recognition. Not all fights happen on camera. Not all fire comes with sound. Outside, the air felt wider. The street was the same, but his pace wasn't. He had always walked like a man on assignment. Now he walked like a man who had chosen his ground. He didn't lose his badge that day. He kept it, for now. But its weight had changed. What used to be armor now felt like a question, not about what it protected, But what was it protecting him from seeing? Later that week, word spread quietly. Official memos used language like operational realignment and strategic personnel adjustment. Internally, people knew what it meant. Dion was no longer the point of contact on the Kellner file. No official reason given. No public announcement was made, but anyone watching could read between the lines. The Bureau hadn't removed him. It had simply stopped pretending it wanted him involved. A junior analyst stopped him in the hallway days later. She didn't ask about the case. She just said, "You could have kept going." Up. Dion looked at her. Up where? She opened her mouth, then closed it. No answer. Didn't prove his point. At home, Mildred sat in her usual spot, her body still, her mind listening as always. He told her what happened, not as a confession, not as a report, just as the truth. She nodded once. "You didn't leave them," she said. "You just stopped lying for them. That was all. No speech, no applause. Outside, the world hadn't changed, but inside, Dion had, and that was enough." The silence didn't end. It expanded. Not in outrage, not in retreat, but in acknowledgement. After Dion stepped back from the case, after the last form was signed and the last door closed softly behind him, nothing exploded. There were no protests, no firestorms, no speeches, only air, still thick with memory, the kind of memory that doesn't fade because it never finished being lived. A week later, something new appeared. No announcement, no press advisory, no signature at the bottom of a grant. Just space, claimed, not requested, in the center of Monument Square. The permit had been filed under a public art clause, buried in civic code, executed without fanfare. At first, it looked like scaffolding. A few passers-by paused, wondering aloud what it was, but then someone recognized the shape taking form. A long curve of fractured wood, splintered at one end, suspended within a transparent pillar that rose 7 feet off the ground and glowed faintly at night. At the base, no plaque, no dedication, only a single line etched into the glass. The broken law, that was all. It didn't need more. The structure rose from the ground as if summoned by memory itself, silent, uncelebrated, undeniable. The transparency wasn't symbolic. It was literal. The glass didn't obscure the cane, it protected it, as if what had once been snapped in an act of domination now stood encased in a kind of civic shrine. It wasn't vengeance. It wasn't forgiveness. It was a reminder, unmoving, undeniable. The artist didn't claim credit. The city didn't release a statement. It just appeared, and then stayed. No one claimed ownership. That's how it became sacred. People didn't gather in crowds. They arrived in pairs, alone, silently, scattered by time and instinct. Some came early, in the hush before sunrise. Others came after work, their collars loose, their bags heavy with the day. But all of them came the same way, slowly, and without needing direction. They found it, stood before it, didn't speak. No one took selfies, no one climbed the base. There were no security rails because there was no need. Reverence doesn't require fences, it only asks for space. The cane hovered there like a fracture preserved in amber, untouched, but not untouched by time. People looked at it as if it were alive, not because it moved, but because it had moved something. It wasn't just a symbol of what was broken, it was evidence of who broke it, and what refused to stay down. On the 5th day, someone placed a single glove at the base. Not a bouquet, not a candle, just one black leather glove, palm up. By evening, it was gone. No one said who removed it. That was part of the language now. Things arrived, then left, without needing to be explained. Some visitors stood only for a few seconds. Others lingered. A man in a faded marine jacket stood for nearly an hour, arms crossed, not blinking. A teacher brought her students in silence. No lesson, just presence. One boy looked up and asked, "Is that the real one?" She didn't answer. She just nodded. That was enough. There were no docents, no audio guides, just glass, wood, shadow, and memory. On the 7th day, someone tried to play a song from their phone, a low gospel hum that didn't quite fit the air. A woman nearby simply looked at them. Not harsh, just steady. The phone went silent, the air returned, and the cane remained. untouched. Mildred didn't come right away. There wasn't hesitation. It was timing. She didn't need a spectacle. She needed stillness. When she came, there was no camera, no escort, only the sound of her shoes over pavement, her hand trailing lightly along a railing for balance, not to support her, but to mark her movement like ink across the city's skin. Dion followed, steps behind, not speaking, not leading, just there, the way a son should be when his mother is already more than enough. Mildred stopped a few feet from the glass. She didn't reach for it right away. She let the air speak first. She tilted her head slightly, as if listening to the silence, as if waiting to see whether the world around the cane still had anything to say. Then she moved forward, slowly, no tremble, no flourish. Her hand rose, and with the gentlest press of her fingers, she touched the bottom edge of the display, where the fractured wood rested in stillness. She didn't trace it. She didn't knock. She didn't linger. Her palm simply rested there, not on the cane, but on the memory it carried. The glass was cool, but the moment was warm. Not soft, not gentle, just full, like something was returning to itself. Around her, people did not gather. They noticed. They paused. But no one stepped closer. No one invaded the radius that now felt sacred. A quiet understanding spread across the square, unsaid but absolute. This moment was hers, and in it, the city became a witness again. She didn't speak, not to Dion, not to herself. Words were for places where silence hadn't yet earned its power. This place didn't need them. After several seconds, her hand lowered. She turned, slowly walking the same line back through the square, never hurrying, never unsure. Dion followed. Still behind, still silent, a child, no older than 6, clutched her mother's coat nearby. The child's eyes stayed on the glass. He tugged gently, then asked, "Why isn't anyone talking?" His mother looked at the cane, looked at the people, then said simply, "Because everyone already knows." She didn't smile. She didn't elaborate. She just let the truth settle into the air like breath, and the cane remained, still broken, still standing. By nightfall, the square was empty again. Not abandoned, just resting. The pillar stood beneath a halo of low streetlights, the fractured cane casting a quiet shadow across the tile. It no longer needed explanation, no longer needed defense. It had become part of the city's landscape, the way scars become part of skin, not erased, not hidden, just present. The people who passed by didn't whisper, they didn't gesture, they simply glanced, and in that glance carried something away, like the weight of memory folded into their coat pockets, like a mirror were no longer afraid to reflect. No one cleaned the glass, but it never smudged. No fingerprints, no vandalism, no flash. The silence around it was a kind of shield, one born not of fear, but of respect. This wasn't a place to protest. It wasn't a place to weep. It was a place to know, and knowing didn't require volume. It required stillness. It required standing. It required a certain kind of humility that the system had never mastered, but the people had never forgotten. Across town, someone tried to write an article titled "What It Means." They deleted it before finishing. Another drafted a tweet. Sometimes the city speaks without saying anything. It got posted. No hashtags, no tags. Still, it reached hundreds. Then thousands. It became the pinned thought of a moment too large for slogans. Mildred never went back. Not because she couldn't. Because she didn't need to. The cane was no longer hers. It never really had been. It belonged now to the world that had tried to look away and found it couldn't. It belonged to the shadow it cast, long and unmoving. It belonged to the child who asked why no one spoke, and the mother who answered without hesitation. It belonged to the space between fracture and permanence, to the pause between breath and truth. It belonged to the silence, and the silence held. The silence didn't echo, it carved. And in the space that followed the monument's stillness, a single act arrived like a shadow unannounced. A letter, no emblem, no watermark, no envelope with any return address, just way on a desk that hadn't asked for it. Dion opened it with the care of a man who already knew what it would contain. It wasn't a threat, not a defense, just a request, handwritten, crooked like it had been composed with too much pride to ask for help and too much fear to stay silent. The name signed at the bottom was unmistakable: Kellner. He didn't go through a lawyer. He didn't channel the request through official bureau access. He sent it as a man cornered, not by bars, but by what silence had started to mean. "I want to talk," it said. Just that. No apology, no admission, just a hook cast in a direction Kellner was never trained to admit mattered. Dion didn't reply, not for days, not because he needed time to think. He didn't. He needed the silence to swell, to surround Kellner long enough for him to feel what it was like to be the unanswered one. 3 days later, Dion arrived. No announcement, no entourage, no camera, no notepad. He didn't come with evidence. He didn't come to listen. He came for something deeper than either. He came to leave something behind. The room was bare, 4 walls, 1 table. No glass divide, no surveillance. This wasn't protocol. It was something older, something quieter, the kind of confrontation that only exists when both men know they are not there to win, only to finish something that had already begun before either of them spoke. Kellner sat, hands flat, posture straight, chin slightly raised like a man trying not to look like he'd already lost. But it was there, in the way he didn't speak first, in the way he didn't smirk, in the way he didn't ask for a chair to be pulled out or pretend to stretch. Dion sat across from him, silent. Let the pause carry. Kellner cracked first. "So," Kellner said, voice gravel-thick, too practiced to sound casual, too forced to carry calm. "You came to watch me rot?" Dion didn't blink, didn't move. His stillness held its weight, a silence sharpened into something surgical. Kellner leaned forward, fingers edging along the cold metal table, posture tightening like a man forcing the illusion of control. "Or maybe you want something," he continued. "Justice? Closure? Hell, maybe you want me to say I'm sorry, shed a tear, beg a little. Is that it? You want me to kneel?" The room didn't shift. The silence didn't flinch. Dion let the words settle, let them evaporate into nothing. And then, when he spoke, it was with the precision of a scalpel. "I want you to remember this feeling." Kellner blinked. "What feeling?" "Irrelevance." The word hung like frost. Not loud, not fast, just final. Kellner tried to laugh, but the sound broke halfway. "You think a cage breaks me?" he said, his voice scraping against itself. "You think this room matters to me? I've had worse days." Dion didn't lean back. He didn't smile. He said, "This isn't about the room. It's about who's not listening to you anymore. You spent your life believing people reacted when you moved, obeyed when you spoke. Now they change the subject when your name comes up." Kellner clenched his jaw. "You're not bureau anymore. You gave that up. For a moment. For a camera and a crowd." Dion leaned forward just slightly, his voice a low blade. "No, I gave up pretending that protecting people like you meant serving the law. You weren't the mission, Kellner. You were the mistake we kept calling necessary." Kellner inhaled, sharp, the kind of breath taken before a punch, or before admitting there's no punch left. "You think this'll matter in 5 years?" he snapped. "You think your grand little stand rewrites the system?" Dion's reply came without pause. "No, but it rewrites you." Kellner didn't respond immediately. His shoulders twitched, like his body couldn't decide whether to rise in anger or collapse under the weight of being unseen. For the first time in the entire exchange, he didn't know where to place his hands. He shifted in his seat, then stilled again, forced himself upright. "You think you've won," he muttered. "You think walking in here, throwing words around like judgment, makes you clean?" Dion stared, unshaken. "I don't need to win," he said. "I just need to make sure you don't forget." Kellner sneered, but it lacked teeth. "You've got no badge, no rank, no office. You're just a man with a grudge." Dion's voice stayed level. "And you're just a man whose name will be remembered for one act, one break. That's your legacy. Not a command, not power, just a broken cane and the silence that followed it." Kellner looked away, but only for a second. "You think that makes you better than me?" Dion didn't flinch. "No, just freer." For a long moment there was nothing. No breath, no motion. Just 2 men in a dead room, with nothing left between them but truth neither could reverse. Dion stood, chair legs scraping quietly across the floor. He didn't move to leave, not yet. He let the weight settle first. Then, almost gently, he said, "One day your son will ask what happened. He won't ask with pride. He'll ask with shame, and I want you to hear your answer. Not the one you give him, the one you're rehearsing right now." Kellner's throat tightened, but he said nothing. His eyes didn't rise. His voice, the same voice that had once commanded units and walked through city halls without apology, didn't come back. Dion stepped toward the door. He didn't need to look back. The silence behind him was confirmation enough. Dion placed his hand on the door, paused just long enough to let the tension thicken, then said without turning, "I don't want you to suffer. I want you to sit in it, to live in what you made, not as punishment, as permanence." Then he pushed the door open, stepped through, and let it click shut behind him, clean, final, and more powerful than any gavel Kellner had ever feared. No guard spoke. No one escorted him out. He didn't ask for clearance. He didn't wait for protocol. He had been allowed in because he had already passed through something Kellner never could: accountability. The hallway beyond was quiet, fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. Every footstep felt lighter, not because the air was soft, but because he was walking without permission, without weight, without chains. Kellner had asked what he wanted. Dion had given him the only answer that mattered. Not remorse, not revenge, not even justice, just memory, the kind that doesn't fade, the kind that crawls into a man's bones at night and whispers, "Your son will know." Because power doesn't rot when taken, it rots when remembered differently, and no monument, no appeal, no buried file would keep the boy from learning the truth. His father had been feared, yes, but not respected. Loud, yes, but not lasting, and somewhere in that same city, under the watch of a transparent glass pillar, a broken cane still stood taller than the man who had tried to shatter it. He hadn't expected to feel anything after the cell, not after staring down the man who had once broken more than just a cane, not after watching power recoil into its silence. Dion had told himself that was the closing act, that everything needed to be said had already found its shape, but the world doesn't always listen to resolve. Sometimes it waits for someone smaller, someone who isn't yet part of the machine, to remind it what it sounds like to speak without an agenda. That reminder came in the form of an envelope, thin, undecorated, delivered by foot, carried not by a lawyer or protester or politician, but by a girl no older than 11. She didn't wear anything flashy, just a plain yellow hoodie and jeans that didn't quite reach her ankles. She walked across the street to the courthouse, stood in line between two adults filing noise complaints, and waited for her turn. When it was hers, she stepped forward, placed the envelope on the counter, and said, "This is for the people who make the rules." Then she turned and left. No fanfare, no camera, no adult was standing behind her telling her what to say. Just her, a neighbor, a child, one of the quiet ones who'd seen everything and been told nothing. The letter ended up on a table beside a half-dozen typed statements from city staff and legal analysts. Someone opened it out of curiosity, expecting maybe a doodle or childish scrawl. Instead, they found pencil marks, dark and precise, written slowly, like the words themselves had been carried for weeks, and only now found the courage to come out. The paper had no greeting, no title, and no date, just a few lines. And in the center of the page, without emphasis, without flourish, it read, "I used to think people in uniforms were the good guys, but that day, the bad guy had the badge." The letter didn't need an introduction. It didn't need framing. It didn't even need a name. Once read aloud, it did what no diagram, no sworn testimony, no bullet point policy ever could. It broke the script. The hearing room, usually stiff with protocol and political choreography, suddenly found itself breathless. Some of the officials looked around, expecting someone to clarify that it was just a child's perspective, as if being young might disqualify truth. But no one spoke. No one dismissed it, because deep down, everyone in the room understood what it meant for a child to say the badge was the bad guy. That wasn't a political statement. That was a wound. A few members of the committee shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, pretending to scroll through tablets or adjust their jackets. One older man, whose career had been built on phrases like restoring public confidence, tapped his pen too many times, then stopped altogether. It was one thing to be accused by activists, challenged by attorneys, or confronted by camera footage. It was another to be named by a child who hadn't even been invited to speak, but somehow said the most unforgettable sentence in the room. Somewhere in the audience, Dion felt something shift, not around him, but inside. The sentence hung in his chest like weightless iron, not heavy, but inescapable. He remembered his childhood. Remembered the first time he looked at a badge and thought it meant safety. That illusion had died quietly, the way illusions do, not with a crash, but with erosion, slowly. Then all at once, and now here was a girl who hadn't even made it to middle school, and already she had to relearn what he had spent years trying to forget, that authority, unaccountable, becomes a threat. He looked down, unsure if his reaction was visible. It wasn't rage. It wasn't sorrow, it was something quieter, like the bottom edge of grief, the part where mourning meets fatigue. And still, he didn't speak, he didn't shift, he let the sentence sit there, untouched, like a scar left uncovered, not to heal faster, but to remind everyone it was still fresh. The moderator folded the paper gently, almost reverently, and set it down beside his notes. He didn't comment. He didn't transition. He simply let the silence stretch, the kind of silence no policy rebuttal could interrupt. Around the chamber, people shifted, not because they were bored, but because they'd been caught off guard. Not by a new fact, by the clarity of a child too young to be politicized, too honest to be softened. Some of the attendees glanced toward the media benches, wondering if the letter would make headlines, if it would be clipped for a sound bite and swallowed whole by the news cycle. But this wasn't that kind of sentence. It didn't scream. It didn't burn. It just bled, quietly and in public. A community liaison leaned over to a city rep and whispered something, maybe asking whether the girl's name had been recorded. But the answer was already known. No one had asked. And that was the point. She wasn't trying to be known. She was trying to be heard. And what she said was now part of the official record, not as evidence, as an indictment. Outside the hearing room, a few people began gathering in the hallway, holding phones and whispering to one another, not journalists, citizens, workers from the block, 2 teachers, a janitor from the public library. They hadn't seen the letter, but they'd heard about it. And that was enough, because you don't need to read the words to feel the sting when a child tells you she doesn't trust what you wear anymore. Dion remained seated, unmoving, but inside him, a slow rupture was forming. Not a crack, a soft collapse of the part that had always held things in. He'd been trained to compartmentalize, to shelve pain until the mission was complete. But this wasn't a mission. There were no objectives left. No one to arrest, no one to rescue, just a room full of grown adults who had just been told by someone barely tall enough to reach the mailbox that their uniform was no longer a problem. It was a threat. The room moved on, or at least it tried to. Another speaker approached the microphone. Another slide deck loaded. Someone cleared their throat and resumed a timeline of incidents and departmental reviews. But no one was listening. The air had shifted. Something had cracked that no one was willing to admit out loud. A single sentence had undone a wall of careful language, and somewhere near the second row, Dion sat still, eyes forward, body upright. But he wasn't there. Not fully, he was somewhere else. Somewhere smaller, quieter. Somewhere like the porch steps of his childhood home, where he once watched his mother place her purse down slowly after being stopped for walking too confidently. Somewhere like a grocery store aisle, where a security guard followed him down every shelf. Somewhere like the corner of a classroom, where he didn't raise his hand when the teacher asked, "Who do you go to when you're in danger?" And now, years later, he sat in a room full of officials, lawyers, suits, and screens, and heard a little girl echo what he had once tried so hard to silence in himself. They wear the badge, but that doesn't mean they're safe. He blinked once, then again, and then he dropped his gaze. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't visible to most, but it was the first time he'd allowed it to happen since this all began, since the cane. since the blood, since the silence. A single tear traced down from the corner of his eye. Not because he couldn't hold it in, but because, for once, he chose not to. He didn't wipe it. He didn't hide it. He let it stay, because that's what you do when a child says something the world should have said first. You don't respond. You remember. It didn't arrive with fanfare. There were no press leaks, no dramatic announcements. The invitation was quiet, formal, sealed in government paper, and worded with the kind of precision meant to sound respectful without revealing weight. Mr. Dion Winslow, you are requested to appear before the Subcommittee on Oversight and Reform. The hearing subject line, Institutional Accountability in Law Enforcement. That was it. No mention of the broken cane, no mention of Mildred, no mention of blood. But everyone in that room, from the front row to the marble columns above, would know exactly why he was there. He accepted not to settle a score, not to spark a moment, but because some truths, once seen, demand to be entered into record. He arrived alone. No legal counsel, no camera crew, no entourage draped in slogans, just Dion. A dark suit, no tie. A collar buttoned sharp, shoes quiet against the hall floor. He carried nothing but presence. The guards didn't question him. The aides didn't brief him. One pointed silently toward the hearing chamber. Inside, everything was crisp, wood polished to a mirror's sheen, microphones perched like vultures over every witness, a bottle of water, a stack of printed agendas. The room didn't buzz. It pulsed. Dion was led to the far seat of the witness table. He sat, back straight, hands still. He didn't fidget. He didn't review. He had nothing written down, because this wasn't a performance. It wasn't a theater. This was just another room. Taller, cleaner, more fragile than most, but still just a room. Across from him, seated in order on an elevated dais, 12 members of Congress watched with a mix of fatigue, calculation, and practiced concern. Some of their minds were already made up. Some were here for sound bites. Maybe one or two were here to listen. Behind him, the rows filled. Suits, analysts, clerks, a face or two from the last hearing, all watching, not because he was famous, but because he'd refused to disappear. The gavel cracked, a nameplate gleamed, and the chair called the hearing to order. They read the names, they took the oath, and when the mic in front of him turned red, Dion leaned forward. It was his now. He didn't clear his throat. He didn't scan the room. He didn't introduce himself again. Dion leaned into the mic just enough to be heard and said, "The cane broke. My mother fell. I stood up. They got scared. That was it. 4 lines. No context. No build-up. Just the hard skeleton of a moment. This chamber would have sanitized into paragraphs, but the silence that followed proved it didn't need more. Some members of the committee blinked, expecting him to continue. One or two leaned back in their chairs, already feeling the weight of what had just been said. It wasn't testimony, it was memory, boiled down to its most violent ingredients. There was no way to discredit it, no diagram to counter, no camera angle to dispute. Just 4 things that happened, delivered without anger, without plea, without apology. The chair, perhaps sensing the room stall, asked gently, "Would you like to elaborate, Mr. Winslow?" Dion looked at him and said, "No." It wasn't defiance, it wasn't disrespectful, it was discipline. He hadn't come to convince, he had come to be clear. And clarity has no echo. The next voice came from the right flank of the panel, a congressman in a crisp navy suit, white, mid-50s, the kind of politician who specialized in neutral tone and controlled optics. He leaned toward his mic and said, "Mr. Winslow, do you believe your experience has biased your view of law enforcement as a whole?" A pause, a smile. Then, "Do you hate the badge?" The question landed the way it was meant to, gentle on the surface, but shaped like a knife. Dion turned slightly in his chair, eyes meeting the congressman's without flinch. He let the space breathe, then answered, "I don't hate the badge. I hate the men who make it mean nothing." The sentence cut through the chamber like static in glass, no raise in volume, no emphasis, just placement, clean, precise, irreversible. No one followed his answer, not immediately. The congressman who asked the question leaned back in his chair, face unreadable but hands suddenly still. Other members shifted, papers shuffled, and someone cleared a throat that didn't need clearing. It wasn't discomfort, it was recalibration, because when a man sits before you and names what you've allowed to rot, there's no script left to read from. The chair, with the careful tone of someone trying to return to procedural rhythm, asked a follow-up about reforms. Dion responded with the same cold economy. Reforms are tools, but tools don't change hands that refuse to use them. Another congresswoman asked about training. You can't train out what's rewarded in silence, Dion said. A third suggested community outreach. Dion, outreach doesn't work when the hand still holds a gun. They tried to pivot, they tried to soften the room with language that sounded like solutions, but Dion never raised his voice. He never shifted in his seat. He just kept answering with statements that felt less like dialogue and more like gravestones. He wasn't here to brainstorm. He wasn't here to offer blueprints. He was here to lay facts down like cinder blocks, immovable, ugly, unvarnished. Each sentence stripped the illusion that something vague and noble had cracked. It hadn't. It had been broken the whole time. And now the pieces were being placed in their laps, one line at a time. Some in the audience took notes furiously, perhaps trying to capture phrasing that would survive on headlines. But nothing Dion said was meant to trend. Everything he said was meant to last. Because these weren't arguments. These were the aftermaths. And the aftermath doesn't need to win debates. They just need to stand long enough for silence to look like surrender. By the time the final question was offered, the room no longer felt like a hearing. It felt like an aftermath. The language on the nameplates had faded into the background. Titles meant less. Roles blurred. What remained was a single voice that had refused to be performative, refused to offer pain as a spectacle, refused to do what these rooms often demanded, to plead. The chair thanked him. Dion didn't nod. He didn't linger. He stood with the same calm precision he had entered with, no flash, no gesture, just presence. A few aides glanced at him, unsure if they were supposed to say something. They didn't, because something about the weight of what had been said made all commentary feel disrespectful. He walked out without turning back. No interviews, no reporters chasing him down the hall. Just footsteps disappearing beneath marble and memory. Outside, the day hadn't changed. The sky was the same. Traffic still flowed, but somewhere in the air was the sentence he'd left behind. I don't hate the badge. I hate the men who make it mean nothing. And even though no one clapped, no one wept, and no one fell to their knees, that sentence stayed. It was heavier than applause. It was sharper than outrage. It didn't ask for anything. It gave, and in doing so, it made the chamber just a little quieter, a little colder, a little more honest, because the truth, once spoken plainly, doesn't fade. It settles. The sound of the Capitol dissolved behind him like a memory being folded into silence. Dion didn't wait for a car. He didn't take the designated exit for witnesses. He simply walked, step by step, without urgency, without hesitation. It was a strange kind of peace, one built not from closure but from clarity. The kind of clarity that comes after you've said everything that needs saying, and all that's left is to act. When the invitation had first come, official, courteous, guarded, he'd already known how it would end, not with a vote, not with a verdict, but with a decision that had been echoing in his chest long before anyone else realized the ground had shifted beneath them. He didn't walk fast. He didn't check his watch. The city buzzed around him the way it always had, but it felt quieter now, as if something in the concrete itself had heard what he said on the hill. The cane broke, my mother fell, I stood up. They got scared. 4 lines. 4 fractures, and somewhere inside those syllables, something that used to feel solid, orders, duty, hierarchy, had cracked open. What was once a shield had become something else, something weightless, something hollow. The badge no longer burned against his hip, but it didn't belong there either. It had become a relic, And Dion didn't carry relics, he buried them. He crossed 2 blocks on foot, past traffic signals, past strangers who didn't recognize him, past the agency's unmarked car parked where it always was. No one followed, no one called out, but he felt the eyes, not of the city, of the walls, of the system that had watched him for so long. Watched him blend in, excel, stay silent, and now watched him leave. The bureau building hadn't changed. It never did. That was the point. Same reinforced glass, same concrete silence in the lobby, the same worn emblem above the entrance, raised metal, flanked by stars meant to say authority, but now reads like memory. Dion stepped through the rotating door without stopping, without hesitation, like he still belonged. And, in a way, he did. No one had told him to go. No papers had forced his hand. This was a choice. But choices like these don't start when you sign the form. They begin the moment you realize staying means lying. The badge still sat on his hip, clipped clean, no scratches. It looked right. It always had. That was part of the problem. The front desk agent glanced up. She was new. Her eyes tracked his ID as he passed, but didn't call out. Either she didn't know who he was, or she did and understood that when a man walks like this, without a bag, without a phone, without pause, you don't interrupt. He moved past the metal detector, past the wall of recognition plaques, past the hallway where he'd once memorized every fire exit like a reflex. None of that felt sharp anymore. None of it felt like his. Up 1 floor, down the corridor. The hallway to clearance administration looked exactly as it had 100 times before. Fluorescent lighting, gray tile, numbered door. Dion didn't knock. He entered. The office was empty except for a tray on the desk. Standard issue, plastic, labeled incoming. That was where it went. His envelope, white, unmarked. Inside, typed resignation, effective immediately. No justification, no farewell. Just one final directive, signed and dated. He reached into his jacket, removed it, and laid it inside the tray like a man placing something heavier than paper. Then he reached his waist. The clip was simple, a standard fastening. No special mechanism, no ceremonial latch. It came loose with 2 fingers and a steady hand. Dion didn't hesitate. He didn't pause to look at it. He didn't polish it with his sleeve like men do when they still believe in the thing they're returning. He just unclipped it and held it for a second, not like it was precious, but like it deserved a clean finish. The badge sat in his palm, cool metal catching the office light, small and unremarkable for something so loaded. Years of training, missions, protocols, late nights, covered names, locked rooms, all compacted into that inch of steel and silence. And now, just an object again. He placed it on top of the envelope. Gently. No weight, but it landed with the kind of finality that doesn't echo. It just stays. He didn't press it down. He didn't center it perfectly. He just let it sit there, crooked, real, the way truth always looks once the uniform's been peeled away. A rustle outside the door. A voice down the hall. No one entered. No one said his name. The place knew. These buildings remember energy. They remember footsteps. They remember when someone who was once part of the bloodstream is no longer pulsing in sync. And Dion's presence had shifted. He wasn't one of them anymore, not by punishment, not by force, by decision. He turned, not slowly, not dramatically, just turned like the conversation was over and nothing more needed saying. And it wasn't. The desk was still. The badge remained. The hallway ahead empty. No applause, no confrontation. Just the absence is being built in real time. The door closed behind Dion, and in its quiet, something larger began to shift. Not in the bureau, not in the hill, but in the direction all eyes suddenly turned next. The media had chased him until his final step out, and then, almost instinctively, they turned to her. To the woman who had not spoken to a crowd, who had not given interviews, who had not called for anyone's resignation. The woman whose cane had been broken, whose silence had outlasted every soundbite. Mildred. They tried everything. Emails, messages left at her door, letters slipped under the threshold. The porch outside her apartment complex began to draw cameras. microphones on long poles, reporters rehearsing introductions as if the woman behind that door might one day step into the frame and validate their script. But she didn't. Not on the first day, not on the second, not on the fifth. Neighbors reported she still walked her familiar morning route, guided by steps she knew better than most could navigate with sight. She didn't answer questions. She didn't change her pace. She moved like she always had, slow, straight, sure. It only made them come harder. Requests turned into pressure. A few headlines appeared. The woman who sparked a storm. The silence that split a city. There were offers. Networks wanted to fly her out, sit her beside anchors, let her speak her truth, but she declined each one. Not with speeches, but with absence. She didn't want to be interviewed. She didn't want to be profiled. She didn't want to be explained. And so the mystery grew, not because she was unknown, but because she was known too well, too clearly. Because you can't sell what won't let itself be edited. They waited outside her building like clockwork. Morning crews, evening crews, local stringers, national anchors. Everyone wanted the same thing, a quote, a sentence, something clean enough to headline, sharp enough to trend. But Mildred remained quiet. She walked with the same rhythm, cane tapping against pavement with no urgency, no fear. She passed by camera lenses without turning her head, never breaking stride. If anyone asked, she'd offer a polite nod, but not a word. Because Mildred understood something they didn't, when people want your pain, silence is resistance. When they want your anger, stillness is a boundary. Then, one morning, she stopped, not for a press line, not for an interview, but for a child. A small voice had asked, "Ms. Mildred, why don't you talk to them?" She turned her head slightly, not because she could see the girl, but because the voice was honest. No hunger behind it, no demand. Just curiosity. A moment passed. Then Mildred said, clear and calm, "My eyes don't work, but I see people are starting to." The child nodded slowly, said nothing. The cameras caught it, that single sentence. Just that. They didn't need more, because in a sea of noise, one clean line like that doesn't ask to be repeated. It settles into the ground and stays there. The story broke before noon. It ran across headlines with no distortion. No one dared alter it. The sentence is printed exactly as spoken. No paraphrase, no reframe, just truth dropped like weight. My eyes don't work, but I see people are starting to. Some called it profound, others prophetic. But those who had been watching from the beginning knew better. It wasn't prophecy, it was patience and a warning. By afternoon, the networks didn't know what to do. They played the clip, then played it again. A woman standing still, a cane in her hand. Her voice was steady, without edge. No inflection for drama, no tears, just words, honest, delivered in the same tone you might use to say what time it is, but that was what made it cut. It didn't arrive dressed in outrage. It arrived like gravity, unavoidable, impersonal, irreversible. She hadn't told anyone what to do. She hadn't scolded or pleaded. She'd just said what she saw, in her way, and for the first time in weeks, the commentary quieted. Op-eds shifted. The debate didn't flare up. It cooled. Because what can you say in response to a blind woman telling you she sees better than the people watching? Not in anger, not in pride, just for clarity. It wasn't what the media wanted. They wanted emotion. They got presence. They wanted a symbol. She gave them substance. And now they couldn't twist it without looking foolish. They couldn't ignore it without looking blind themselves. Somewhere in the city, an editor sat with their headline copy and didn't change a word. Just set it down, bold, center, and clean. The woman who couldn't see made us stop looking away. It wasn't clickbait. It wasn't spin. It was the truth, rendered in 12 words. Schools printed it. Libraries framed it. Someone painted it on the side of a brick wall 3 blocks from the incident, and no one covered it with graffiti. Because even those who weren't watching closely knew this wasn't just about race or policy or power anymore. It was about attention, about who we give it to, about whom we pretend not to hear when they speak too quietly to monetize. In the weeks that followed, no one saw her take a podium. She didn't. No charity tour, no memoir, no press junket. The city tried once more to offer her a platform. A councilwoman came by with a formal invitation to appear at a public roundtable on racial optics and public force. Mildred listened, nodded, then said, "They don't need to hear me speak. They need to hear themselves stop lying." That was the end of it. The invitation was withdrawn the next morning, not because she refused, but because no one wanted to be in the room after that reply. They stopped asking after that, not out of defeat, but out of recognition, because Mildred wasn't a symbol that could be displayed. She was a mirror no one wanted to stand too long in front of. Her refusal to perform turned into the most honest performance of all. She went back to her routine. Same route, same cane, same stride, but something around her changed. Bus drivers slowed when they saw her. Strangers stepped aside without being asked. She didn't demand reverence. She demanded nothing, but everyone knew now. Ignoring her was no longer an option. One journalist, in a closing line buried at the bottom of their column, put it this way: "She stayed still. We're the ones who finally adjusted our vision. No quote necessary. Just a fact. Like shade returning after too much exposure. No anger in it, just a correction." And so Mildred remained, not exalted, not amplified, but heard. She never moved, but somehow, without saying much of anything, she made an entire system step back and reconsider where it stood. And maybe that was enough. The streets hadn't changed. Not the sidewalk cracks or the faint graffiti under the overpass. Not the flicker in the streetlight 2 blocks from the church. But something in the way people walked had. Steps slowed near her building now. Conversations quieted when they passed her window. Respect didn't make a sound, but you could hear it in the way noise avoided her corner. Dion walked these blocks with a different weight, not heavy, not hesitant, just full. Full of what had been said, done, lost, and finally given back, not as justice, but as truth that had found its landing place. He carried the cane wrapped in black cloth. No emblem, no nameplate, just a purpose folded in wood. The porch hadn't changed either. Same chipped paint, same uneven step on the left side, same screen door that sighed when pushed open. She was seated just inside, where the light filtered softly against the outline of her shoulders. Her hands rested lightly on her knees. Her posture, as always, held like a statue that refused to crumble. He didn't call her name. He didn't announce his presence. He didn't need to. Her head tilted slightly before he reached the final step. "I heard your footsteps." The words weren't warm. They weren't cold either. They were clean, like someone who doesn't need to ask questions because they already know the answers are walking toward them. He stepped through the doorway, the cloth still in hand, and stood in front of her without ceremony. She said nothing. She didn't ask. She didn't reach. She waited. Dion unwrapped the cane slowly, carefully. The way someone handles a piece of memory turned physical. The wood was smooth, rich and balanced. It wasn't just a cane. It was something made. Not bought, not borrowed. The grain ran long and uninterrupted, and in the center of the shaft, carved without flourish but impossible to miss, were the words, "Still standing, still her son." She didn't smile, she didn't frown. She lifted her hand and traced the letters with her fingers, slowly, precisely, as if reading not a phrase, but a scar healed right. Her thumb paused on the final word, "son." She gave one nod. Nothing more, not approved, not a surprise, just understanding. Dion didn't speak. There was nothing left to explain. He had spoken where he needed to. Now this was just the last line being etched where it had always belonged. The air outside shifted. A soft gust moved through the frame of the door. The neighborhood felt still, as though it too understood this moment wasn't for cameras or statements, just stillness. Then came the light footsteps. Children, not running, walking. Quiet curiosity drew them near. A boy, maybe 8, stopped at the edge of the porch, eyes wide not with fear, but with reverence he didn't have words for. He looked at the cane, not at Dion, not at Mildred, but at the object that now sat across her lap like a quiet crown. "Is that the cane?" he asked. She turned her face toward him. Her voice was steady. "It's mine." He hesitated, then took a step closer. "Can I touch it?" The question hung like a feather, gentle, unsure, hopeful. Dion looked to his mother. She tilted the cane forward without a word. The boy reached out, fingers brushing the wood with a kind of care too old for his age. He touched the carved letters, but didn't try to read them. He didn't need to. Some things you understand with skin. No one said anything else. Not Dion, not Mildred, not the child. The street didn't erupt. The audience didn't applaud. But in that silence, something settled, something final. Because no one had protected her, but now no one dared touch her.